So hello everyone and welcome to our discussion on getting started with behavioral science. My name is Mary McLennan. I'll be moderating today's session. Um, uh, so I'm the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General, as well as I lead an initiative called the IOM Behavioral Science Group, which I will speak to shortly. So essentially today's conversation will be around what are some steps we can take to both in the early days, getting off the ground with our behavioral science work, but then also where can things look if we progress a little bit further in the future as well. So we'll hear from a spectrum of experiences from our panelists today. Before we get into that, I just wanted to speak very briefly about UN Behavioral Science Week. So this is obviously an event one of the events of the week. This year we bring together 38 UN entities. So it's our biggest and most diverse behavioral science week yet. There's still some more sessions to check out later today, as well as tomorrow, on climate and health and peace and security. So much more to explore. And we'll put some of the links in the chat for you there to understand a bit further as well. Okay, so in terms of the discussion today, what we'll be hearing from our panelists. They'll share some remarks about their experiences with behavioral science overall. And then we will also have the opportunity for Q&A with all of you at the end. So we ask that you please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote the questions of your colleagues in the Q&A box. So if you don't have a question yourself, check out the box. There's probably one there, or hopefully there's one there that's interesting to you, and we can ask the questions that are most relevant to the audience. And then as well, the chat is open, but we won't be taking questions from there. So if you want a question asked, Q&A box. Okay, so now on to our panelists for today. So we have 4 panelists with us from diverse parts of the UN, sharing their different experiences with behavioral science. So unfortunately, Christelle couldn't be with us today from ICAO, but she's been a part of other webinars. If you're interested in ICAO's experience, you can check out last year's Behavioral Science Week and other things that I've done if you want to unpack a little bit further there. We also have Sébastien Vaudel from UNDCO. He's in the Seychelles. He'll be speaking to his experiences applying behavioral science and reflecting upon it in the country context. We'll also hear from Sonia Gario from UNESCO, who will speak about her experiences reflecting on behavioral science when it comes to education. And then we'll also be hearing from Luca Putman from the IOM, who's been applying behavioral science in interesting ways over the last number of years. She's been involved in a number of our behavioral science weeks. And then finally, someone who's probably well known to much of the behavioral science community in the UN, Courtney Price, who's the behavioral science lead at FAO, and he's been doing quite a bit of work in behavioral science, really getting an initiative off the ground. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and have a poll for all of you regarding your experiences with behavioral science. So if we can launch the poll, or I can try to. Great. So it's to what extent have you applied behavioral science in your work? It'd be interesting for our panelists and for me as well to understand a bit more about where the audience is at. Are you very early stages? Have you done a project before? I think we'll say 1 is 1 not at all, obviously, and then 5 being an expert. So maybe 5 is you've applied it in projects. You feel like you could talk to other people about it. You're a bit more advanced in your thinking overall. Okay, sounds like we have a bit of a mixed bit of experience here. So I'll give you maybe about 30 more seconds to put your answer in. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. Oh, okay. With that, okay, well, the polls, so there you go, you see the poll. So we're mixed, it's pretty even across all areas. So we have some people who are further along in the early stages, and that's great because we have panelists who can speak to all of that throughout our discussion today. All right, so with that, on to our first speaker for today. So what we'll be doing in terms of the format of the session is we'll have, I'll ask 2 questions to all of the speakers, and then at the end, we will have an opportunity to ask questions. So over to Sébastien, how are you getting started with applying behavioral science in your work? Over to you.
Hi, Mary. Hi, everyone. So I've applied and I'm just starting. So on the scale that you've just shared, I think I would be on 1, maybe 1.5, but we've decided to add behavioral science as a layer on top of an overarching approach of strategic foresight and system thinking for budgeting and strategic planning. Because we are conducting, in Seychelles with a co-leadership with the Ministry of Finance, where we trained 23 trainers from the Ministry of Finance and then accompanied them in conducting strategic foresight and system thinking exercises with 87 public entities from the government of Seychelles. And when we were advancing through this strategic foresight system thinking exercise, one thing that struck me is that most of the long-term objectives implied as maybe as a first driver or first enabler behavioral change. It was like change in the way consumers behave, the way citizens behave, the way we treat waste, for the circular economy, you name it. Like everywhere, behavioral change was on top of the agenda on the long-term changes. But at the same time, there was no behavioral science were nowhere to be seen. It was always like, even when you go down to roadmaps and all, it was always like awareness raising, awareness campaign, etc. And so it reminded me of the phrase from Maslow: when your only tool is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So it was a bit of the same, no? Like not trying to understand better what can be done about it, but just throwing awareness campaigns to hope that we will induce a behavioral change on the long run. And so we decided that was exactly the same way we had empowered uh, actors from the Ministry of Finance, but then through them, all the government and within a whole of society approach, we could do the same, empowering them with tools from behavioral science to pursue their objectives and accelerate the changes they wanted to see, but they rather hope that would magically happen after a short awareness campaign.
Thanks for that, Sebastian. Really interesting to think about how behavioral science can relate to so many different areas and where we can reflect upon embedding it into our work. So really, really great perspective. So we'll come back to you with more on that topic shortly. But now for our next speaker, Sonia from UNESCO. How are you applying behavioral science in your work or getting started with it overall?
Hi, can you hear me? I cannot
Yes.
turn my video back on. Apologies. You'll have to do it on your end if
Okay.
that's possible.
I
Oh,
think
there
you
we
can.
are.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this invitation to this important discussion. Like Sebastian, I was going to say I'm at one, but if it could go into the negatives, it would probably be even before one in terms of getting started. So, where I'm sitting at UNESCO, we work mainly in education policies. I'm in the education sector. And we work with the high-level representatives of ministries. So we mainly work on policy work, which is a bit of a challenge because I'm struggling with how to get started and even introducing, or how can we use the behavioral sciences for changing policies. This is how I'm thinking about it now, and I'm not even sure I'm getting it right. So what we did last year, and thanks to you, Mary, we decided to have an informal webinar just to introduce the field of behavioral science to colleagues in my small team, to get them to know about this field, and which not many colleagues were really familiar about, although the foundational theories are familiar to a lot of people. And then to move that forward, I decided to introduce it as into a report that we're releasing in 1 week, in fact, on early child care and education, which is one of the areas of work in the sector of education. And this is a report that really is about reporting on the SDG 4 indicators related to learning and education. And what I decided to do is to showcase an example using an example from a partner that implements programs at the country level, and who have used the behavioral sciences to inform their programming for young children. And it's a program that tries to change cultural values around the importance of early literacy, and to encourage parents to read to their children before they start school. So it's meant to support children to get to school with some emerging literacy skills. And so in a report about how it is important to improve the early literacy and numeracy and social emotional development of young children before they start school, in addition to saying these things are important, we decided to include an example of how the behavioral sciences can come in to make a change in this area. So it's a start. The report is a joint publication between UNICEF and UNESCO and with other global partners. And hopefully through its readership, it will be a way to introduce the behavioral sciences into education.
Okay, thank you for that, Sonia. I think this is a common thing that we see across the UN and even governments too, of how do you get started? It's something just including it in a report and having webinars and discussing it in the early stages and just getting people more aware of what it is. As Sebastian mentioned too, people aren't even, behavioral science wasn't mentioned in a lot of topics where it was very relevant. So this is definitely something that we've seen across the UN. I'd be curious to hear if anyone, the panelists, but also in the audience has some experiences as well of how they've done that. So thank you very much for that, Sonia. Next over to our panelist, Luca from the IOM. Would you like to come in and share your experiences applying behavioral science in the IOM? Over to you.
Good day. Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for the invitation. So I work for IOM, and I've worked on several programs that cover between 10 and 20 countries, mostly Western, Central, Southern Africa. We use behavioral science, obviously, to implement programs that are trying to influence people into adopting positive migration behaviors. And that is not just focusing on migrants, that also includes focusing on communities, when working on social cohesion, acceptance of migrants, but also facilitating the reintegration of returning migrants. We look at governments and how they can adopt more positive attitudes towards migrant protection, what they can do to better protect migrants in their own realm or area of work, but also addressing issues such as trafficking and smuggling, all of that. We're obviously looking at migrants themselves as well to see how they can adopt safe practices or at least bring themselves back to safety when they end up in vulnerable situations. That's definitely one part of our work as well. And then finally, we look at youth, generally, since they're a big target group for, to become migrants eventually, and try how to see and work with them towards, adopting safe migration practices and choosing those options that are going to give them the biggest opportunities. So it's very vast and it kind of addresses all these different levels. And these behavioral sciences are very important to, as a starting point, to inform our interventions and make sure that they are effective in the end. So I had a little slide on this. I'm not sure if Johanna could help me pull this up, just to show kind of where we are on this scale. I'd say that personally, I might be more on the higher end, maybe 4 or something, because I've been doing this work even before I was in IOM. But that is not necessarily representative for the whole organization. I think there we're really at beginning stages and trying to take baby steps, into making it almost a norm. I created this kind of scale where we go from capacity building over, implementing pilot projects, making it a best practice, and then eventually ending up into being the norm. There you are. Thank you very much. Can maybe zoom out a little bit there. And I think we are at the second step of we did a lot of capacity building, at least inside of the programs where I work. You should know that IOM is a projectized organization. So anything we do really has to be channeled through these different programs and projects. So we did a lot of capacity building. We have the SBC, Social and Behavior Change Academy. And from there, we do lots of pilot projects in countries, but we still have to reach kind of that point where it becomes a best practice, and then eventually it could become the norm by, mainstreaming it through the organization. But we are getting there. And from my perspective, I take a very pragmatic approach to this generally. I think some of the enablers, some of the things that help me in making that a reality is very practically first, like we piggyback on existing like contracts from other agencies and organizations. Like often we don't have in-house capacity to do this kind of research or even design of programs based on findings from behavioral science. We need specialized vendors. And honestly, I will always go through contracts like from UNICEF because they have lots of LTAs and then we kind of shorten a lot our procurement process, which might seem like a detail, but for me, it's really a big enabler to be able to do that, to kind of convince project managers to give it a shot. And the second is like we use a lot of existing materials for capacity building. I adapted a lot of like the tools from UNICEF again, SBC guidance that they have. They're pretty advanced on this. But also IDEO, which is a corporate human design firm with a nonprofit branch. They have a lot of materials on human-centered design. We kind of adapt most of their workshops and materials to our own subjects to not start from scratch. I mean, it's repetitive, but it's a reality. And then in terms of case studies as well, I really try to tend to take them from other organizations and show like how this works to get people really over that first hurdle and kind of getting started with it. So that's in a nutshell from my side.
Great, thank you for that, Luca. Really interesting as you're setting yourself up there, the problems and the context in which you work is so multifaceted with all the different actors that you work on. I think one thing maybe we can unpack with behavioral science is we think about the individual and the systems, and I think the system in which you operate is particularly complex. So it's interesting how you're taking behavioral science in that context in general. And then again, this idea of piggybacking. How do we take existing projects and work and embed behavioral science into it and apply it? I think that's something that we're hearing from other panelists, and it's something that I think colleagues across the UN can reflect upon as well. You don't need necessarily a whole team of behavioral scientists with you to get started. You can start to reflect upon it and think about how you can embed components into your work, and then the case studies elements as well. Of course, this is so important to really showcase how it works. But oftentimes what we've seen is you can give a lot of case studies from other parts of the UN, but until you show case studies from the IOM, maybe people don't always see the value of it. So we can talk about that in the Q&A, but I think this raises a lot of interesting and fundamental questions when it comes to getting started. So thank you very much for your remarks, Luca. And last but not least, over to our colleague Courtney in FAO for his reflections on behavioral science and FAO. Courtney, over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and colleagues. It's great to join you. It's interesting to think about FAO as as a group that has gone a long way with behavioral science. When also we are one of the biggest things we've learned is how much further we all have to come as a UN. So it's an interesting way to take the pulse of things. I guess officially FAO initiated a corporate response or a corporate approach to behavioral science mainstreaming in around 2021, leading up to the Secretary General's guidance note. But in many ways, many technical divisions of FAO have been looking at behavioral science and even using it in different disguises like development economics, or when we did rigorous social behavior change communication experiments. Those things were, however, not super connected and quite seen quite disparately across the organization. So there was a great interest in kind of consolidating and understanding these things together. I think there's kind of one main lesson that we have learned that I'd like to share that is, I'm sure, reflected in many other people's learnings, is that behavioral science is many things to many people. And what I think there's three kind of ways we've been thinking about behavioral science that really helped us kind of come together around it. And that is, first and foremost, as a rigorous science, a very hardcore application of applied research methods that is building on helping understand behavior and sometimes actually even influencing behavior for good. But it's also an amalgamation of insights. It's a wealth of knowledge on how people behave in various contexts, a lot of which is well researched in specific contexts we're working. Some of it isn't, but where it is useful in those contexts are applicable. It's very much something we don't necessarily need a scientist to do, but we need somebody to help us unpack that research or see where it might apply. Emailing in organizations is a big one, and we had a great experience working with the UN Behavioral Science Fellowship not too long ago, where Lucy Martin did an amazing experiment on how we could increase attendance to a very important meeting just by changing emails, just by changing messaging, and changing the way people were invited, and that increased attendance by 10 times. So that's an example where it doesn't have to be only about implementation on the ground, but it can also be internal processes and procedures. But the final thing is, it's also a lens on the world. It's a lens on how behavior works and how it helps us approach our problems a little bit differently. And this has been both the biggest opportunity and also the biggest challenge, I think, because we have so many ways or lenses of seeing the world already. And this one, in some, for many respects, is new. It's a no-brainer when you think about what FAO is trying to do. Transform agri-food systems means changing behaviors on the ground for all of us. So we're being more productive, more efficient, more equitable. We're leading to better nutrition and better food security through our actions. Those actions that need to change. So it makes sense, right? But this lens is really where the approachability of behavioral science becomes more important. I'll just say quickly, like what we've tried to do and what we've landed on doing now. We really focused initially on the quick wins. Let's do experiments, let's do pilots. And I think that's a really good approach. However, I think we've come to the point where there's a big, after you do a pilot, there's a good question of, and then what? Happy to share some examples, but the main part is we've now packaged that pilot, the experiential learning, coaching and working with people, pairing people with behavioral scientists on projects they care about and developing an innovation experience, where at the end, they've helped do the experiment and seen the results on a subject matter they care about. That's been critical. In addition, we've built up our capacity to spark curiosity and be more approachable by making knowledge more accessible, making ourselves as a nudge unit more available and more visible in the organization. We're also supporting those champions that are not just early adopters, but also on the periphery that are trying different things in their offices, and they're trying to use behavioral insights in various places across the world. And I had great pleasure working, for example, with a wonderful group in Nairobi and Mozambique who had the capacity and courage to try behavioral science, and we supported them, and they did some cool things, essentially quite autonomously towards the end. And the final thing is events like this generating visibility. I think it's very important that we keep the conversation going, not just about advocacy to the entire system, but just as importantly for internal advocacy. These events are a reflection of ourselves, and I've had a lot of FAO colleagues approach me or my colleagues after seeing these events. So I would never underestimate the importance of being present and contributing to the conversation from your entity's perspective, as that's drawn a lot of attention and interest in the internal change processes that we're trying to offer. So I have a lot more I could say, but that probably would dilute from the benefit of it. I think that the last point is that FAO has positioned in the behavioral science inside the Office of Innovation, which I think is a strategic lesson that we've learned also looking at the connections across the quintet of change. So systems thinking, foresight, innovation, there's a lot of crossovers. So we have that, by being a little bit siloed in the beginning, now we've learned to be a bit more cohesive under one umbrella. And there's still a long road ahead, getting to the point of managerial buy-in, funded projects. Making it easier for people to try something new is at the core of both the opportunity and the challenge that behavioral science offers.
Thank you for that, Courtney. This is so insightful. And a great way we can give colleagues a view where they could go after a few years with behavioral science and organizations. And I think you started out with your definitions of behavioral science, and also importantly, how colleagues have been sort of reflecting upon this already, whether it's development economics, other spaces. So I think it's interesting, again, like the work that FAO does and the types of topics that you handle. Obviously, behavior change is important, and it's not that it hasn't been addressed before, but how do you, again, as Lucas said, piggyback or kind of leverage what's already ongoing and build on it instead of trying to create something outside. But also too, I mean, how to do this, how to pilot, how to build capacity, how to build allies in your organization, managerial buy-in. Maybe these are all topics we can explore in our Q&A. And thank you for the shout out to Lucy, our behavioral science fellow. We actually published the case study in our UN Behavioral Science Review. So we can put that in the chat as well if you want to know about how FAO has applied behavioral science in that way. But I'm sure there are many others. And for all panelists, if you'd like to share resources, please put them in the chat with colleagues so they can also hear a bit more about what you're doing. All right, so that's the end of our first question for our panelists. Does anybody want to make any further remarks or comments or comment on each other's what you've said? Feel free to turn on your camera if you'd like to come back in. Any other reflections that we've seen experiences from the RCO and the Seychelles, thinking about how do we embed this in the thinking when it comes to other areas of innovation? If not, that's fine as well. We can go to our next question.
I'd be really curious to know a little bit more, even if it's more from an organizational design point of view, where you guys are positioned inside your organization and how that works as I mentioned, we're underneath the chief scientist within the Office of Innovation, but I'm sure there are many other ways of doing this, and curious to hear about them. I know WHO is essentially like a chief behavioral science kind of operation, which is very different than ours. So curious.
I think colleagues, you can feel free to come in. I mean, I think a lot of them are kind of in various corners, but did anybody want to comment on where they are? Luca, come in. Yes, please. Where are you in your organization? Oh, you're muted, I think. Oh, I don't know. Your sound doesn't seem to be working. Doesn't show that you're muted, but yes, I think we can hear you now.
I try to put it on.
Yes.
Does it
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry for that. I like that question, like where are we positioned, because for us it's been like a long questioning. I mean, and we haven't figured it out yet. So in IOM, there is no such thing as like, we don't really have like an innovation office or like a department that focuses on behavioral science or social and behavior change or anything like that, really. So right now you'll just have a few people here and there, like inside programs. I'm more like a project manager kind of role, but not at like HQ level. And it doesn't make it easier for us to kind of, make sure this is being adopted across. But at the same time, I sometimes feel that maybe because of the identity and the nature of the organization, sometimes it might even work better to be inside the projects and the programs. Like if I had to choose, I'd rather be inside of the program than at like the global structural level, because then you kind of lose touch with what's actually happening on the field. But ideally, and again, I need to refer to UNICEF because I think they're the most, at least from the ones that I know that are closest to the type of work that we do, they're much advanced. And then they would have like, a pretty senior level coordinator in their New York offices, and like every regional office and every country office will have their, like, they call it SBC, social behavior change kind of focal point, but it's a full-time job, like an officer. But at IOM, we definitely don't have that. So I think kind of the answer is it's possible to do it from wherever you are, but it would help if it was formally kind of recognized inside the organization, which for the moment is not our case.
It's interesting. Maybe thank you for that, Luca. I think it's really important to see what's happening on the ground, especially talk about the context is so important with behavioral science to understand what's happening. Sebastian, do you have any thoughts from this? You're in the resident coordinator's office. What is it from your perspective, reflecting on behavioral science?
Well, yes, I'm at entry level, so covering Mauritius and Seychelles, and as a senior economist, I would say I'm in a good position not to be an expert myself, but to pull resources from across the UN system, including headquarters, but also all UN agencies. So to respond to a demand from the government, a particular demand. So this has been the case for strategic foresight and system thinking. And as you will remember, Marie, I referred to DCOHQ when we decided to, with the government, to add the layer of behavioral science, and this is when they referred us to you. So I guess that from a country level, of course, we cannot overwhelm you with demands from the 190 plus countries where we are, but we can receive support from headquarters or from different agencies. For instance, I didn't know before starting to prepare this behavioral science week about, for instance, Courtney sitting in the FAO, but this is definitely a resource that we could pull, as food security is also one of the key priorities that we explored through Foresight. So just to mention that wherever you sit, I think you have a wide range of resources in the UN system, and you can try to mobilize them depending on their availability.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Sebastian. I think it's something that colleagues across the UN maybe don't appreciate or maybe know about, to the extent that can be useful. Because we ran one project in Argentina, our colleague Claire Hobden, the ILO, and one of our behavioral science fellows, and we worked with the resident coordinator's office in Argentina, and they were able to open so many doors in terms of connections to the different country office teams, to what's happening on the ground. Then again, as Luca mentioned, they know what's happening on the ground. We don't at headquarters and where we are. So, so maybe that's something to explore in the future. How do we work better with country offices to do this work, given your vantage point and viewpoint going forward? So it's a whole other a whole other topic to unpack.
And
Did you want to come
also,
in? Yes.
yeah, no, sorry, just as a follow-up comment, definitely, and also referring back to another experience that we had. You remember we are organizing here quarterly engage yes, discussions with the youth on global
Mm-hmm.
subjects that they feel are of concern for them, and they want to understand better what's happening at global scale and regional scale. It's called the Noontime
Mm-hmm.
Knowledge, and once we had it on Earth Day on waste management, and they were very interested in behavioral change, hearing about it. And so I was able also to go to you to ask, and then you are able also to refer to other experts from
Mm-hmm.
beyond the UN system, from the academic sector, etc. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that there is all the resources that are out there in the UN system, but
Mm-hmm.
also these resources can refer us to secondary resources in the academia, in the practitioners from across private sector, civil society. So
Mm-hmm.
I think definitely there is a wealth and a depth of knowledge and expertise that we can tap into.
For sure. There's so much across all of the behavioral science group. There's Courtney, there's Luca, there's all these things. There's UNICEF, as you mentioned, there's WHO, there's all these different initiatives ongoing. And we all have our internal networks, external networks. There's lots here that we can unpack together. So maybe after behavioral science, we can have a big conversation together about how to do this more meaningfully. All right, maybe just over to Sonia. You're in UNESCO headquarters, right? What's your
Yeah.
vantage point there working on behavioral science?
So the question that Courtney posed is really interesting because we don't have such an opportunity at UNESCO where I'm sitting in the sector of education. So UNESCO has essentially 5 sectors. Education is one of them. So the equivalent of having what Courtney had brought up, having like an office for foresight and research would mean at the director general level, which is that would bring together all of our sectors. So we don't have that opportunity. We do have within the education sector we have 3 divisions, and within each division, several units. And within each unit, there's a bit of work here and there, but it's fragmented. And oftentimes I've noticed, and from headquarters, the other challenge is that we don't really do much of the in-country work that's done through our field offices. So if headquarters wants to implement something, it becomes a bit of a challenge. That's also not our responsibility to be implementing in field offices. And only if there's ever a collaborative project is where we might be able to come in and encourage the use of a behavioral science strategy. Where I'm sitting, so one, it's a bit fragmented, and it's not really our direct responsibility at headquarters. And then secondly, we work with ministries of education where we work really heavily with revising education policies. So at that level, the struggle is, how do we, at that level, at the policy level, how do we say something about behavioral science? This is the struggle that I'm having in just bringing up the topic of behavioral science to colleagues, because it's difficult making the case for it. And I myself I'm struggling with, how do you bring it up and say, okay, if you're going to be revising an education policy, then what? How does behavioral science come in? So that's my struggle. And I'd love to hear from others like Courtney or Luca, if they have experience with that. How do you deal with the very high levels of government when it comes to supporting them with their policy revisions?
Very good question. We can unpack. I think all of our panelists have some perspectives on this. There's having conversations internally in our organizations about how to further behavioral science, but also with the partners that we have, including member states. All right. Okay. So I see some cameras going on and off. I do have another question for all of you before we go into further discussion. So, I mean, maybe you can feel free to turn your camera on if you'd like. Like maybe have a discussion together about this. We have more of a conversation as opposed to just me asking you questions. So my next question is, what have been some of the key successes or challenges or lessons learned that you've had affecting upon behavioral science in your organization? So with this one, maybe we'll start with Sonia. What are some of the key learnings you've had in the work that you've done so far?
I don't know. I feel like we're still at, -1 on that number line. I think in terms of successes, it remains to be seen because, like I said, we made sure to include it as a recommendation in our report. It's a global report on early childhood care and education that is basically going to be a big, important report that is, going to be a key instrument for ministries in thinking about how to improve access and opportunities and the quality of early childhood care and education. So they will be looking at this report for the next 2 years until the next report comes out. And we made sure to include a case study on the use of behavioral science, and we make sure to include, and we cited the work of the UN and the SG's guidance note in the recommendations section. We mentioned how, education should get into learning more from the behavioral sciences. So it remains to be seen once this report is released, what the uptake will be and how we can learn from it. But for the moment, I'm still myself trying to learn to see how we can improve our use here within the education sector. So in terms of lessons learned outside of, including it in the report, I don't have anything further than that.
Yeah, well, that's a big step. I mean, that is definitely a step forward in terms of integrating behavioral science. It's part of at least one report. People will read it and they'll start a conversation. So we'll see what results from it. But I think that is a step forward. So I think you should congratulate yourself on that at least. It's all relative in terms of success, but that is, oftentimes getting started exactly that step. It can be maybe the hardest, and then things go from there. So thank you for sharing that. When you have the report ready too, let us know. We'll share that with the community. Okay, next over to you, Courtney. What are some, I know you've many successes and challenges and lessons learned, but what are some key learnings that you've had at FAO over the last number of years?
Well, the biggest lesson is one that I should have known by studying behavioral science, is that I'm incredibly biased. And getting over my own bias has been a challenge because when you look at it, I mean, it's a real no-brainer of why we should apply behavioral science, how we should use evidence of what people do, why they do it, and what's keeping them from doing it. How that seems just completely logical and should fit into our project programming and thinking. But I'm convinced of this, partially because of training, but also because of experience. But that doesn't mean other people are, nor does it mean it's smart to approach them assuming that they're going to agree with you. And believe you, I think that was some of the initial challenges came around how you start the conversation. And so I guess the big advice from my side, which is super hard to do, is to try to be more of a behavioral scientist when you're trying to promote behavioral science. Understanding the person, the group of people, whether it's internal or external, where are they coming from? The first step of a behavioral design process, empathizing with your stakeholder, understanding where they're at, and then diagnosing some barriers. Why are they not using behavioral science? If you're not asking these questions before you talk to them, and I believe you me, I did the same. You might find yourself in conversations where you thought you had an ally, and actually you've created a detractor because you've approach this as if it was obvious, or if it's some kind of antithesis to all other ways of working. You mentioned it yourself: social behavior change, development economics, behavioral economics, even just econometrics. There's so many experimental methods that are already around, and there's also not a ton of time and resources to always experiment. That assuming people are on board with experimenting is a challenge a misstep you could avoid by really trying to dive into where they're at. Is this something that is going to be interesting to them? So on the levers of change, the things that we've seen work are do some behavioral science together, so it's social, on something people care about, so it's salient. And that's where the pilots that had the most success were co-designed with FAO colleagues in different technical divisions and offices about something they wanted to do. And we've since evolved from that. Now we're offering behavioral design sprints as a non-scientific way to dip your toe in the pool, to get introduced to behavioral science, go through a behavioral science process in a hypothetical form, and allow the natural excitement and interest in this powerful methodology to take root through experience and not through telling or showing or persuading. So we try to make it fun. We try to, when there's funding, which is always a challenge, we try to make it less risky by providing pilot seed money. And we try to make it accessible by, as I said before, making this our methodology visible, and we try to knock on open doors where people are interested and want to learn more. So I think I should probably say in more concrete terms, it's not just about internal buy-in. It's, of course, I mean, we're talking about working with stakeholders in the field, and this is where some of my partners in crime, as I would say, in the behavioral science team here in FAO would be better versed to say so. But there's a lot of need to acclimatize yourself also to the language that we're using in the field, and understand where there's opportunity to discuss maybe trying something different and where there's not. I think initial projects need to really focus on kind of an enabling environment that's already semi there, and not try to tackle head on a project that's completely committed to we need to train these people, and that's how we've always done it. You need to slowly offer small opportunities to work on areas where the default method is so strong that maybe not necessarily very behavioral, and better to work with peripheral innovators that might be trying something in their own backyard. And this is where things like farmer field schools and behavioral science have been very useful, but there's still not a mainstream function. You know, it's still enabling peripheral innovators who are trying things, and not necessarily, sometimes I would say sometimes early adopters or champions are not necessarily the levers of change we assume, because sometimes they're under so much scrutiny and pressure that it's hard for those champions to even though they're committed and interested, to actually dedicate funding or do something completely radically different, depending upon the organizational structure and the culture of the government, the organizational culture that's involved. So just some musings here, I guess. Make it challenge has been, not assuming people are on board. And the successes have been making it salient, making it fun, and reducing risk, making it easier for people to try. Over.
Great, thanks for that, Courtney. It's about, making it accessible too, kind of breaking down some of those barriers about what it is and how to get involved. So I'll leave you, there are some questions coming through the chat. There are quite a few, so if you want to answer them, but one of them for you, Courtney, is a great point around the biases, your bias originally. How do you do that? I mean, you can answer it in the chat maybe, or we could talk about it later, but
okay.
How do you do this in the future? How do you kind of assess yours in the team? How do you reflect upon your biases so you don't perhaps do that again in the future? So maybe you can respond to the question, or we can come back to it together.
Sure.
But we still have.
Do you want me to answer now or not?
Maybe if you put your answer in the chat, we can come back to later. So we're running short on time, and I want to make sure we have all the panelists speak. Thank you, Courtney. All right. So next we have Luca. What are some of the main successes, challenges, or some just of where you are today? You've explained kind of the landscape, but where are you at with your work overall?
Thank you. I read something interesting in the chat that I'll start from, maybe while I ask Joanna if she could, again, please help me pull up this second slide. Someone said well, in private sector, they seem to understand the importance of behavioral science, and it's difficult for us to get it integrated, right? Which I think is ironically, it's funny because in private sector, people need to sell, right? And they understand that if you don't take behavioral science into account, that you're not going to make any money. So that translates into nonprofit sector as impact, our programs are definitely going to be more impactful if we use it. So then the question is, why would people not do it, right? So from my perspective, I think the main hurdles that we need to jump, or the main challenges, they are quite obvious. And again, it's not because I don't want to be repetitive, but we need to acknowledge what's there to be able to address it. And from my perspective, it is budget, time, and staff turnover. Meaning that, Courtney already said it, we need to face it. We are always working in a limited budget resources setting, both budget and time, and every project manager, every staff on the ground wants to do their activities, implement them within the time allocated, but within the financial resources. If we want to do a bit of research before to inform our programming, it's going to take more time. The research is rarely fast. And it's going to take extra money, and it has to come from somewhere, right? So like one of the ways that I try to address it is by also like keeping a few envelopes available. So as I said, I've always been working on program level. So like right now, my program is in about 14 countries. They all have their country budgets, which don't necessarily account for this because it's a very competitive, marketplace, and they just need to focus on the first needs, which is very often direct assistance to migrants, etc. So I try to keep a bit of a portfolio and some budget available at the global level, so we can kind of, inject money here and there, and then also try to kind of explain again that yes, the time that you invest in the beginning is going to make you save a lot of time in the long run. And again, I'm very lucky to be on a 7-year program, which is very unique in UN, in IOM. I'm guessing maybe less in UN. For us, it's quite unique. Most projects, I think they would range from 1 to 3 years on average. So it is hard to kind of see the impact of it, but luckily if you're a bit of a longer scale, you can see how you win so much time by actually doing that research first and having better activities as a result. But then that again is in conflict with kind of the third challenge, which is staff turnover. Because our projects are so short, people just tend to move easily from one project to another, from one program to another, from one country to another. So by the time you kind of start bearing the fruits of your efforts, you might already be in a different position, and you might be informed or aware of it, but then you're not in a position anymore to like communicate on it. So those are the challenges that we need to be aware of and know that they're always going to be there. And so in whatever kind of suggestion that I make to my focal points in the country staff, people that I'm working with, is going to take into account these limitations that they have, because if we don't, it's just not going to work. It's just going to be, empty advice. So in terms of advice, I have like 3 tips that I can give. I guess I could give like a small example for each to make it concrete. So the first would be start small and really focus on the things that you can do to improve the tools that you have here and there. One example, for example, we work on trafficking a lot. We have this big collaborative on human trafficking data that is not necessarily very accessible to governments. Someone in the chat in the Q&A asked about like engaging high-level governments, or I think it was Sonia, sorry. So what we did is we created a data dashboard that is very user-friendly, that allows you to like play around this data that we have, but that are very like academia-focused, very complex, and create it into something very user-friendly. So any government official can actually use that and use that to download like images for their presentations or for their reports, something like very small, but based on evidence and facts that we have in our like more complex setting, and kind of make that available in some term of like nudging and saying like, hey, use this so that your policy is actually going to be more effective to address trafficking and all of that. So it's a small intervention that like very quickly people understand, oh, this could have a fairly big impact because people will actually use it. Or like to go out of the digital sphere, we have these range of tools for community conversations, again, on migration. We would work with some specialized firm to like make sure that these tools are the best possible tools available, adapted to the audience that we work with, that they really understand the language, that it is interactive, like not just create any manual, but really create the stuff that people can use. Into the second point of advice, connect with the pros. So I mentioned this piggybacking before. Someone asked the questions. Yes, I do use LTAs from other organizations all the time. I can mention 2. Like right now, we are piggybacking on an LTA from UNICEF for human-centered design. I'm using them to help my colleagues in both Egypt and Ethiopia to work on very specific projects with companies like, I'm not going to name drop here, and I'm not going to make their publicity, but definitely check out the global UN marketplace to try and do the same. And we're also piggybacking on an LTA from UNESCO with the firm who manages their website. And actually those people are helping me to adapt a platform that we have to inform young people on migration and make it as user-friendly as possible. So again, this is in the digital sphere, but this again is behavioral science, interaction, design and interacting with digital applications, since we have so many. sometimes we forget that also there is a lot of research and UX that goes into that. And again, on the same project, we are in the process of hiring a UX, so user experience design expert as a UNV, to really focus on that. So like looking for these atypical profiles, companies, people that can work with you, join your team, to really have that expertise. So connecting with the pros. And then the third point is to communicate, communicate, communicate. I'm thinking of an example in Ethiopia where the team worked with 3 universities to kind of come up with livelihood projects in communities to kind of address irregular migration. And as a result of this, like their interventions were so much more impressive. Like they built a whole production unit for like, it was like a waste project turning into a new product, so environmentally friendly. It checked so many boxes that they would have never have achieved if they just went in, asked like, what are we going to do? You know, start whatever the community would come up with. So there was a small example, but we picked it up and we mentioned it again and again and again in every presentation and every report, that now people understand like, hey, maybe I should also try and work with the university. So if you have good examples, but if you don't mention them, you don't talk about them, they're not going to inspire others. So whenever you have something that you feel like this is a good example of how behavioral science did help me improve my activity, you need to say it like over and over again until everyone knows it, and so that they will remember next time you start something.
Thank you, Luca, for that. I think this is really insightful, lots of insightful some important points to add. And I think we've triangulated a few spaces too. Courtney spoke about communication as well and the importance of that in FAO. So it sounds like you have some people who agree with you. And then also the idea of finding the right partners. You know, we talked about how do we set teams. They're all very important. And it can vary depending on the project and the type of work that you do, obviously. And then, yeah, finding these ways to start small, as Sonia mentioned with her report, getting off the ground, being involved in the first initial report, and then maybe going from there and seeing how you can spread. So thank you for that, Lucas. So we'll come back a few more minutes for questions. Hopefully we get one question at the end. And I did want to hear back from Sebastian, some of your thoughts and reflections on successes and challenges at the country level in particular. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary. So just endorsing what Luca just said on starting small, and also what Courtney said before on being aware that a pilot needs to lead to something more. It's not an end per se. I would say that a lesson learned from here. The first one is the necessity or the value added of adopting a phased approach, like having clear where you want to land, not only through a pilot, but indeed start with the first phase, second phase, etc. And this leads me to a first challenge. It's the question of time. And by the way, I presented the idea, the approach, how it comes a layer, but I did not say concretely what we did in implementing the approach, because for now we are still in the first phase with strategic foresight system thinking, like mainstreaming it into budgeting and plans, etc. And so we did not reach yet the phase of mainstreaming behavioral science 2 as an add-on, you know, as another layer of analysis and capacity. And so it's time consuming. It takes time. You have to be patient. You have to accept that you need to go with the processes ongoing at a country level, because I think if you want to force too much innovation, it just doesn't match. You know, you don't have the capacity of absorption from the government. And so regarding this, and this will be my second and last challenge or lessons learned, is the real necessity, at least from my perspective, maybe it's different elsewhere, to ensure ownership and leadership from the government. You can obviously use it internally in the UN, you know, and for instance, we started exploring also how to use behavioral science to design our events for UN days, you know, because it's always like, okay, we'll do a wall and everybody will paint something or a word or whatever, you know, I'm exaggerating a bit, but how about using behavioral science to see how we can start some processes a bit more profound, you know, in terms of inducing change, etc. So this can be internal, but what I'm most interested in is engaging the government from scratch to have an impact on public policy. And in this sense, you need to have ownership and leadership from the beginning. And to do so, you need to embed it into existing national processes, systems. You need to respect the capacity of absorption. And so you need to be patient also in the making, because you need time, to adapt, not just throwing a training right away and then see what happens, but really adapt it early on. And then second, you need also to be patient in the implementation phase, because you need to follow a bit the availability, the priority, and all of the government. So maybe I say you need because it's just imposed on me, but I think that when you accept this, you think you're building something solid and that will survive you, which is the idea. No, it's not just to do a one-off, but really to have something that will grow beyond your particular involvement. And so this is what I would share as I think lesson learned.
No, it's a very important point. I think it underscores a lot of what we've been discussing here about, it's interesting to talk about, get excited about behavioral science, but the phased approach and doing it with thought and care and respect for what's happening on the ground and with different parts of the UN. It's so important, as you said, to keep it sustainable. Sure, as Courtney mentioned, you can do these pilots and quick wins, but to keep it sustainable, there's a whole other conversation to be had there, which is what you're unpacking. And I very much like your point about bringing the member states in. I mean, we do this in the UN, but you have a strong relationship with the member states that you work with, but really kind of involving them throughout from the start of our projects more meaningfully. I think this is something that we can reflect upon in the work that we do. So thank you for underscoring that point. I think we can have a whole session on that.
Yes.
That's a really interesting topic. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Not just a small tip thing, hearing you, a very small tip, concrete, instead of training directly end beneficiaries, always think about training trainers that will remain or become expert. With the experience, it's always good because we come and go, but people will stay and they can drive processes throughout the years to come, and so good to have this approach sometimes.
It's a very good point as well. People, as I think Luca mentioned this too, the transition of people both in member states and then also within the UN, it's important to think about that too. These are all very important sessions. Actually, we have a session tomorrow about how to work with partners to some extent with member states. So we'll unpack this a little bit, but not exactly in the way you've described. So maybe next Behavioral Science Week, we can have a whole session on just this with you and some colleagues. All right, so we've reached time here, but if the panelists can stay for, I think some of them need to leave, but if you want to stay for a little bit, we can answer some of the questions from the chat. I know you've already been answering a few of them. So Sebastian, if are you able to stay with us? It's just Courtney. I think Sonia needs to leave. Luca,
No, I
can you stay?
No problem.
I can stay.
Okay, I think other colleagues have had to leave, but we can answer a few of the questions in the chat. As I look at them, Courtney, are there any that you think you want to speak to in terms of the response? And I responded to a few of them. Are there things you want to elaborate on, or do you think you've answered?
Oh, there's definitely no way to answer all of these wonderful questions.
Yeah.
But I just was typing a question into training and a question about what kind of course and training to pursue, and I'm sure I didn't do a great job in my written response, but my main point was to Eric, who was questioning which training, which skills, what kind of a training education should you pursue if you're interested in this type of work. And I said, my thought was, I think it really depends on your interest. I think if we use that 3-part science, insights, lens kind of trifecta as a rubric, if you're really keen to do the science part, then you need a hardcore science degree. I mean, then getting into experimentation is challenging and requires a lot of study. Whereas not everybody needs to be a behavioral scientist. I think there's a lot of value to design thinking or behavioral design, even certifications that can lead you to understand, being able to use that behavioral science lens on problems. And as Sebastian say, know when to hire behavioral scientists. That's a critical role in the UN. And we don't have enough people that know how to do that, know when a problem needs a behavioral scientist. So I guess I was just saying, lots of different training out there, but I'm curious to know also your advice, Mary, and others. But from my experience, it really depends on you, first and foremost, what your interest is. And if you haven't gotten a handle on the difference between the scientific application of applied research versus, the design thinking type of aspects, that's a good place to start. Even just, some kind of trying to boil down those various ideas and think which area of this huge area of work you'd be interested in jumping into.
Yeah, I think there are lots of ways to engage with different communities around the world. I think some of them mentioned in the chat here. So we have the behavioral science group. You're welcome to join our webinars. We also share the resources of colleagues across the UN. That's one avenue, but there are also many other ways you can engage with university networks, other sessions that happen. So I think there is interesting starting points, and we can, if you're interested, I'm happy to follow up with you. But then beyond that, as Courtney mentioned, there are ways you can get further in depth of experience. We often advocate for a more learning by doing approach. Until you've run a project yourself, it's very challenging to understand. I think Courtney mentioned this too. It's challenging to understand what it is. You can go through trainings, but then it doesn't really become real until you've seen it in practice. So if you could, I would say, join some of the sessions that are out there, then maybe see if you could be a part of a behavioral science project, or just sort of see what it's like. That's a way to understand a bit more too. And then you could go from there to get more formal training if you'd like. That's what I would say. But there are, again, everyone's different in terms of what you're after. So thank you. Oh, Luca, you're here too. Great. So there's a question here, which is about, so we've generally touched upon this, but I think it's perhaps important to note in that talks about a lot of the things we can achieve with behavioral science, the positive aspects, but a bit more of the reality when people push back against behavioral science in your organizations, or it could be just innovation more broadly. What are some of those conversations like, and how do you more practically, what do you say when somebody says, behavioral science or innovation, perhaps more broadly, isn't something that we could or should be doing? What are some of the ways you approach that? I know there are different reasons why people might say that, but how do you talk about the importance of it and the need and the value? Bit of a general question, but I feel like, yeah, go ahead, Lucas.
I can try to take that on. From my experience, I think generally people are very positive towards it when it comes to, you present a case study or an idea, or you say that you want to do more of this or that, or I want to do, the SBC Academy. But then it becomes challenging when you start to put it in practice and you have these repercussions on time management and budget and the stuff that I kind of mentioned before. So I think like most of the people, at least that I work with, they understand the importance of it, but then they really struggle to kind of make it a reality through what we actually do. Or then you say like, okay, should we try to find a place for it in the organization, or like what kind of tools should we work on? And then that's like a more difficult thing. So I guess it really depends on where you are, what kind of organization, and what kind of the overall mood is. But from my particular experience, it's always been to try to just do it, like as long as people agree that it has meaning and there's value to it, just try to work with people directly to implement it here and there, and not like be stuck in trying to implement some like overall idea or approach, and that people need to follow it by the letter, but just trying to find like small examples and show people like this is also like behavioral science, and we have actually applied it because we try to create some social or behavioral change. So it started from those insights, right? So I think for me it's more there. I feel like it is accepted in a way that people say it's important, like similar to how we have maybe discussion on gender or like climate change. Everyone will agree this is very important, but then maybe gender officers or climate change officers will say like, well, but we struggle to actually put it in practice. So I think it's a similar kind of thing that we are facing there.
Interesting. So open to new ideas and ways of working, but not quite sure how to operationalize that. It's a good, interesting space to be in. Courtney, Sebastian, what are your thoughts on how you have these conversations? Any insights you might have for somebody who's maybe perhaps facing some pushback, or even clearly articulating the value of this type of work? What do you think?
Rodney, you want to go first? You're
No,
more
you go ahead.
an
Go ahead,
expert on it.
Sebastian. You go ahead, Sebastian. No, please.
Yes, I think at some point, Courtney and others said it like it's it should be a no-brainer, but until you put it on the table, maybe some persons do not have it in mind necessarily that it is actually a science, and that you cannot induce changes just by doing communication, basic communication. So normally when you put it, like okay, if you want to induce change, there is something called behavioral science, and and with tools that you can adapt, etc. It's already something to create appetite. But then the second thing is a general, not pushback for behavioral science in particular, but for innovation in general. Like we already are overwhelmed with so many things to do, and what if we adopt something new, it will be even more demanding, etc. So this, I think that it's always the same argument, like innovation is there not to add to what you are doing, but to make it more efficient or to have more impact. And so at the end of the day, normally it should save you time, maybe not right away, but it's the time that you invest in behavioral science or in any innovative approach that is useful for you. It's time that is actually invested, not wasted, not consumed. And so, whoever is interested in the impact of what he or she does, I think will hear you, not necessarily maybe adopt it right away. But then the last thing, the last level is, for me, from my experience, is really to show how it is adaptable to an organization direction, goals, and capacity. Because until you reach this point of speaking with the words of the person that you have in front, in this comfort zone that he or she feels in, good in, it will always be a bit challenging. You will always have champions that right away, okay, yeah, I love the idea, let's go for it. But then you will always have others like, it's blurry, I don't understand, like I already have too much to do, etc. But when you come to their comfort zone saying, look, you do this, you can do it also this way, and the impact will be that, maybe the conversation can lead to something more constructive. But again, it depends really on many different factors.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point about, just tailoring your conversation to the audience. There's a spectrum of people who are bought in and maybe who need a bit more contextualizing. So thank you for that, Sebastian. Okay, in the last minute here, Courtney, over to you for the final words on this topic of how you get buy-in, but then also maybe more generally the discussion we've had today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is going to sound maybe kind of cheesy or simplistic, but I think it's humility. I mean, we're very passionate people. We're trying to promote something we know is a benefit to our organizations, to our teams, to ourselves. But the funny thing is, behavioral science isn't just one thing. It's really many things. In fact, this is why we have this challenge of is it new or not? I mean, in many respects, people see it as old wine in new bottles, just good social science, right? So yeah, I think the lesson for me is to try to approach it with a bit of humility, knowing you have an idea of how it's gonna benefit, but you're there to discover its benefit to the people you're working with, rather than convert or tell or convince them to have that the benefit you see is the one that's going to be there for you. Already, whether it's how we do talent recruitment and messaging, to how we're getting actually developing a project around farmer field schools in the field, and in innovating around experiential learning and experimenting together with farmers. Regardless, across all that spectrum, those ideas weren't things that the innovation office knew ahead of time and said, or that Mary emailed me and said, here's exactly how behavioral science is going to help you, or the Secretary General laid out perfectly. There are things that were co-created. So I think that humility and being open to being wrong and co-creating with the people that you have, that you're trying to work with and help, not only will help them innovate, but it'll help you innovate as well.
That's a great point to conclude on, Courtney, here. And I think there's also this element of, knowing behavioral science is one tool in our toolkit, right? As people working in the UN, we mentioned innovation more broadly. So we have the right time and place, and having the humility to have those conversations and co-create with colleagues across the UN and beyond. Okay, so I think we've gone way over time. There are many more questions we could debate and discuss. I feel like we'll maybe have another session on this at some point throughout the year. But thank you so much to our panelists for their insightful views on how to reflect upon behavioral science and the work that they do, and even progress. We're looking forward to the next few days of Behavioral Science Week as well. There are a couple more sessions to go. So we shared the links in the chat, but there are some more to come. And yeah, thank you very much to our panelists and for our audience for their great questions. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you soon. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone.
Bye for now.
Bye.